The world had known darkness before. The first men had huddled in their caves while the White Walkers marched. 10,000 years before any Targaryen had ever set foot on Westerosi soil. The Night's Watch had stood their vigil for centuries. Brothers in black bleeding. Into frozen ground so that the realms of men might sleep without dreaming of blue eyes and cold. Fingers reaching through the dark. Poets had written of it. Maestas had dismissed it. And now, at last, it had come again, the long night. Returned like a promise kept by something ancient and pitiless beyond measure. But the Night King had not anticipated what his own hunger for dominion would summon. It began 3 days before the Battle of Winterfell. A glass candle in the crypts, won the Maestas had declared inert for a century. Ignited without warning. Its flame burned not orange, not the red of Rhaenyra's faithful, but white. A cold, singing white that hummed against the stones and sent every direwolf in the castle into a frenzy of howling that lasted until dawn. Bran Stark, seated in his chair by the weirwood, felt it like a ripple in still water, a disturbance in the psychic network of the old god's trees, something vast and foreign pressing against the membrane between what was and what had never been meant to be. The Night King felt it too. Whatever intelligence moved behind those terrible blue eyes stirred with something that might, in a living creature, have been called curiosity. He had been extending his power northward, his fingers of frozen sorcery, probing at the edges of reality as he marshaled his dead. The glass candle's ignition intersected with his working at precisely the wrong moment, or perhaps precisely the right one, depending on which side of the rift you stood on. 40 miles north of Winterfell, the air split open. There was no sound at first, only light, warm, golden, wrong in every way for this frozen hellscape of perpetual grey and ice. Then the sound arrived like a wall of thunder, tens of thousands of voices shouting in a language no man of Westeros had ever spoken, the screaming of horses, the clash of steel on steel, and beneath it all, a deep and resonant horn call that seemed to shake the very permafrost. They came through in waves. Cavalry first, great war horses in barding that no Westerosi smith had ever forged, carrying riders in gleaming armor, their faces fierce and their eyes wild with the confusion of men, torn from one battlefield and deposited, without warning, onto another. Then infantry, rank upon rank of soldiers bearing shields marked with the white tree of Gondor, the horse head of Rohan, the star of the Dunedain Ranges, and among them, something else, shapes that were not quite men, translucent and green-glowing, moving through the snow without leaving footprints, the cursed dead of a king's broken oath, bound by ancient compact to serve until their release was earned. The cold hit them immediately. Men who had been fighting in the temperate night air of the Pelennor fields suddenly found themselves breathing air that burned like knives. Horses screamed and reared. Soldiers stumbled, gasping, grabbing each other for warmth that none of them had. Standing at the center of the chaos, a tall man in battered ranger's armor grabbed the shoulder of the nearest knight and steadied him with a grip like iron. His face was weathered, his eyes grey as a Stark's and just as hard, and when he spoke his voice cut through the panic like a blade. "Hold," said Aragorn, son of Arathorn, heir of Isildur, king of Gondor and Arna. "Hold your positions. We are not dead and this is not defeat." Beside him, a figure in white robes stood very still in the snow, leaning on a staff that glowed faintly at its tip. Gandalf the White tilted his head back, his sharp eyes scanning the dark horizon to the south, where the distant towers of a great castle rose against a sky that was wrong. Too dark, too permanent, lit not by stars but by the pale reflection of something vast and frozen moving in the far north. "This is not the Pelennor," Gandalf said quietly. His voice held no panic. It held something subtler, the careful stillness of a mind rapidly reassessing. "No," Aragorn agreed. "Where are we?" "Somewhere that needs us," the wizard replied. "The question is whether it knows that yet." Behind them, Legolas had already knocked an arrow and was scanning the tree line with elven eyes that could see farther in the dark than any man of Gondor. What he saw made him draw the string back further. "There are shapes in the trees," he said. "Dead shapes. They are not moving yet, but they are watching. The whites at the forest's edge had been there since before the rift opened, a scouting screen of the Night King's dead, positioned to harry any survivors fleeing south toward Winterfell. They had not been prepared for 40,000 soldiers to materialize out of a crack in the air. Even the dead, it seemed, could be surprised. It would not last long. Gandalf planted his staff in the frozen earth and let out a long breath that steamed in the killing cold. Somewhere ahead, through the dark, he could feel something enormous looking back at him, a presence vast and cold and immeasurably old, with a will behind it that bore no resemblance to Sauron's burning ambition but was no less terrible for that difference. Aragorn, the wizard said, and something in his tone made the king go very still. Whatever darkness we left behind on the Pelennor, I fear we have arrived at the doorstep of something older, and it already knows we are here. In the distance, from the direction of that great frozen castle, a horn sounded. Not the warm golden horn of Rohan. Something harsher, human, desperate. The horn of the Night's Watch, calling its last alarm. If you want to see more characters arrive in Westeros, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character you'd want to see in the comments below. Winter is coming, and so are more stories. The ranging party had ridden out at Sir Davos's insistence, 20 men, good riders, tasked with watching the northern approaches for any sign of the dead's advance scouts. Jon Snow led them personally, because Jon Snow had never learned how to ask other men to ride toward death, while he stayed warm behind walls. Ghost ran ahead of them through the snow. The great white direwolf's paused silent on the frozen ground, his red eyes scanning the darkness, with an animal intelligence that had saved his master's life more times than either of them could count. Ghost stopped first. He stopped so suddenly that Jon's horse nearly collided with him, and the direwolf did something Jon had never heard him do in all their years together. He made a sound that was not quite a growl and not quite a whimper, but something caught between the two, the sound of an animal encountering something so outside its experience that its instincts had no category for it. Then Jon saw the light on the horizon, not the blue-white light of the Night King's dead, not wildfire, something warmer, golden, fading even as he watched, like an ember dying in the wind. And beneath it, the sound of thousands of voices speaking in no tongue he had ever heard, and the screaming of horses, and a horn call that rolled across the frozen plain like distant thunder. What in the seven hells? Breathed Tarlet, pulling up alongside him. Jon said nothing. He was already spurring his horse forward. They came over a rise in the terrain and stopped dead at the sight below. Torchlight, real torchlight, not the cold luminescence of the dead, flickered across a scene that made no sense in any framework. Jon Snow possessed thousands of soldiers, organized and disciplined despite obvious disorientation, forming up into defensive positions with the practiced efficiency of men who had been fighting a war minutes ago and understood that stopping was how you died. Their armor was unlike anything produced in the Seven Kingdoms, too fine in some places, too practical in others, bearing devices Jon didn't recognize, and moving through them, literally, passing through flesh and steel without resistance. They translucent shapes of the cursed dead, not whites, not White Walkers, something else entirely, something that registered to Jon's battle-hardened senses as dead but carried itself with the purposeful intelligence of soldiers following orders rather than the mindless hunger of the Night King's army. Those aren't his, Jon said, almost to himself. Whose aren't they? Ed asked. The Night King's. Those dead, they're not his. Before Ed could respond to this deeply unsettling distinction, one of the foreign soldiers on the plain below shouted something in that unknown tongue and pointed up at the rise where Jon's ranging party had silhouetted themselves against the grey sky. Within seconds, a dozen arrows were knocked and aimed upward, and 3 riders on horses that made Jon's mount look underfed were galloping toward them at speed. Don't draw steel, Jon said quickly, raising his hand. Don't draw steel and don't run. Running is how you get shot. The 3 riders pulled up 20 feet away. In the center, on a horse the color of storm clouds, sat a man who looked at Jon. Snow with grey eyes that held the particular quality of someone who had spent a long time being responsible for other people's survival. His face was scarred and weathered. His dark hair shot through at the temples, and he carried himself with an authority that had nothing to do with a crown or a title and everything to do with the weight of hard experience. He said something in his language, clear, measured, a question by its tone. Jon shook his head slowly. "I don't understand you." The man studied him for a moment. Then, in accented but perfectly comprehensible common tongue, the accent strange, the vowels shaped differently, but the words unmistakable, he said, "You are soldiers of this castle." Jon blinked. "You speak the common tongue." "I have traveled far," the man said simply. "Languages were necessary. Are you soldiers of this castle?" "I'm Jon Snow. I command the defense of Winterfell." A pause. Old habits of courtesy overcoming battlefield suspicion. "Lord Commander," or King. "It's complicated." He looked at the army arrayed on the plain below. "Who are you? Where did you come from? And what in all the gods' names are those things moving through your men?" The man glanced back at his army with the expression of someone who had a great many answers and very little time to give them. Then he looked back at Jon, and something passed across his face, recognition, perhaps, or the soldiers. Instinct that identifies a kindred spirit across the barrier of language and culture and the vast distance between worlds. "My name is Aragorn," he said. "I am king of Gondor. My army was fighting a battle of our own, a great battle, the decisive battle of our age, when something tore us from that field and deposited us here." He looked north, where the darkness was absolute and the cold pressed down like a physical weight. "Those shapes you see among my men are the dead of Dunharrow. They serve under an oath they have not yet fulfilled. They will not harm your people." "An oath," Jon repeated, "to fight until their king releases them." Aragorn met his eyes. "I have not yet released them." Ghost had crept forward during this exchange, and now the great direwolf sat at Jon's stirrup and stared up at Aragorn with those red eyes. Aragorn looked down at the wolf, without flinching, without even the slight tension that most men showed in the presence of an animal that could remove a hand at the wrist. He simply looked, with that steady grey gaze, as though direwolves were merely one more thing the world had to offer, and he intended to take its measure carefully before deciding what it meant. Then, from behind Jon's ranging party, a raven arrived, Winterfell's raven, carrying a message tied to its leg with urgent haste. Jon read it in the torchlight and felt the cold settle deeper into him than any winter wind could manage. Bran had seen them through the Weirwood network, all of them, and Bran's message contained only 4 words, written in the 3-eyed raven's careful hand. "They are not enemies." Jon looked up at Aragorn. Behind the King of Gondor, on the frozen plain, the army of Middle-earth was still forming up, still finding its footing in an alien world. And already, the dead things at the tree line were beginning to move. "We need to get your people inside the walls," Jon said. "And we need to do it now." Aragorn turned to his companions and spoke in his own tongue, 2 quick sentences. The riders beside him wheeled their horses and galloped back toward the army. He looked back at Jon. "Lead the way, Jon Snow." The great hall of Winterfell had hosted kings before. Robert Baratheon had filled it with his laughter and his appetites, had drunk it dry and declared it not half bad for a northern ruin. Robb Stark had held his war councils here, young and brilliant and doomed, his bannermen crowding the long tables with their feudal loyalties and their mortal certainties. Now it held something no Stark had ever anticipated hosting, the command staff of an army from another world, standing in the firelight with snow still melting in their hair, trying to make sense of a castle that smelled of old stone and wolf and the particular desperation of people who knew they were going to die and had decided to die fighting anyway. Gandalf, The White walked through the doors of Winterfell's great hall and stopped. He stood very still for a moment, his staff planted on the flagstones, his sharp eyes moving across the room with the systematic thoroughness of a mind, cataloguing everything it encountered. The burning torches, the stark banners, grey wolf on white, hanging from the rafters, the ravens in their cages along the far wall, watching him with their black bead eyes, the maestus chain visible on the neck of the old man, hurrying past with a stack of parchment, the smell of the place, old blood in the stones, recent fear in the air, and beneath both, something older, something that came from the weirwood in the godswood, whose psychic weight Gandalf could feel pressing gently against his awareness, like a hand laid flat on a door. Old magic, he thought. Very old. Not evil, but not tame either. Impressive, said Legolas quietly, appearing at his shoulder with elven silence that made the nearest Night's Watch brother startled badly enough to knock over a bench. Old, Gandalf corrected. Impressive and old are not always the same thing. He began walking again, following Jon Snow toward the far end of the hall, where a table had been cleared and spread with maps. Melisandre was already there. She had come down from wherever she had been keeping herself in the days before the battle, that private communion with her god that she performed, like a woman checking whether a fire she had banked would still be burning when she returned. She stood at the edge of the map table with her hands folded, and her red robes absolutely still despite the drafts that moved through the hall, and she was looking at Gandalf, the White, with an expression that Jon Snow had never seen on her face before. Not certainty. Melisandre always wore certainty like armor. This was something else. This was the look of a woman whose armor had developed an unexpected crack. Gandalf stopped 6 feet from her. His own expression was unreadable, which was to say it was the expression of someone reading very carefully indeed. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The hall around them seemed to hold its breath. The Night's Watch brothers, the Winterfell household guard, Davos Seaworth pausing in his own conversation across the room, all of them sensing, without quite understanding, that something significant was occurring in the space between these two figures. Melisandre spoke first. The Lord of Light sent you. No one sent me, Gandalf said pleasantly, though I've had that argument before, with beings considerably less pleasant than yourself. He tilted his head slightly. You draw on fire. Real fire, not a trick of chemistry or politics, but genuine power channeled through genuine faith. A pause. Who taught you? Melisandre's composure reassembled itself with visible effort. Law requires no teaching. He reveals himself to those he chooses. Yes, Gandalf agreed. That is what they always say. He looked at the ruby at her throat, the glamour stone, the thing that kept her body from revealing its true age, and something flickered in his expression. Recognition, perhaps, or professional respect. The fire you channel is real, he said, more gently. What you build around it, the prophesies, the chosen ones, the certainties, that is where I would be more careful. Melisandre stared at him. In 40 years of serving law, no one had ever spoken to her quite like that. Not with contempt she knew how to answer. With the particular gentleness of someone who has made the same mistakes themselves and learned better. You burned bright when you came through the rift, she said finally, retreating to the ground she understood. I saw it from the ramparts, like a second sun, for just a moment. She looked at his staff. The stone in that staff, it holds fire. Among other things, Gandalf agreed. Jon Snow cleared his throat. He had been watching this exchange with the expression of a man who has survived enough impossible things that he has developed a high tolerance for them, but still found this particular flavor of impossible somewhat taxing. We have perhaps 2 days before the Night King arrives, he said. Maybe less. Whatever brought your army here, he looked at Aragorn, who had come to stand at the map table with Legolas, and Gimli flanking him. We need to decide how your forces integrate with ours, where they fight, What they can do. Gimli, who had been examining the Winterfell stonework with the appraising eye of a dwarf, who knew good construction from poor, looked up at this. What we can do, he repeated. Laddie, what we can do is fight. That's what we do. What we need to know is what we are fighting. Dead things, Jon said. We've fought dead things, Gimli said. Not like these. Jon met the dwarf's eyes. These dead things are controlled by something ancient and intelligent, something with a will. Kill enough of his army and he raises them again. The only way to stop them. Permanently. He reached down and touched the hilt of Longclaw, the Valyrian steel sword at his hip. Is dragonglass or Valyrian steel? Through the heart or through the head? Gimli considered this with the pragmatic thoroughness of a warrior, cataloguing tactical constraints. And this Valyrian steel, is it common? There are perhaps 100 Valyrian steel weapons in all of Westeros. A silence fell over the table. Aragorn was looking at the map spread before them, Winterfell, the surrounding terrain, the approaches from the north where the dead would come. His finger traced the King's Road, the forest to the east, the open ground to the west where cavalry could maneuver. His expression was that of a man who had planned desperate defences before and understood instinctively which features of ground could be made to do the work that numbers could not. The dead can be turned, he said quietly, not looking up from the map. I have seen it. In my world, there are those with power over the undead, to command them, to repel them. He looked at Gandalf. Can your power affect these creatures? Gandalf was quiet for a moment. He was still watching Melisandre, or rather watching the space between himself and Melisandre, the invisible negotiation of two fireline powers attempting to understand each other's relationship to the same fundamental force. I believe so, he said, though I suspect these White Walkers are something I have not encountered before. He paused. The fire will reach them. Whether it will stop them is a question. I would prefer to answer before the battle rather than during it. Melisandre turned to face the map table fully. When she spoke, her voice had lost some of its usual oracular certainty and gained something rarer, the careful tone of a woman, genuinely uncertain and choosing honesty over theatre. The Night King feels you, she said, looking at Gandalf. He felt you the moment you came through the rift. He is not coming faster because of it. She paused. He is coming differently. Daenerys Targaryen had not built her claim to the Iron Throne by being patient with men who would not kneel. She had crossed the narrow sea with 3 dragons and a conviction forged in exile that the wheel of Westerosi power was broken, that the Game of Thrones was a game played by small people for small stakes, and that she was something different, something larger, a queen not by the accident of birth alone but by the fire of purpose, by the long road from Dragonstone to Meereen to Westeros, by every sacrifice she had made and every sacrifice she had demanded of others in the name of a better world. She received Aragorn in the great hall at midday, with Drogon's shadow passing intermittently across the high windows and Missandei standing at her shoulder, and every unsullied in the castle positioned with the precise geometry of a message written in living soldiers. Aragorn came alone, or nearly alone. Gandalf walked at his right shoulder, and Legolas at his left, and Gimli 2 paces behind because Gimli had announced that he went where Aragorn went and no queens. Protocol was going to change that. Jon Snow stood to the side, watching, in the particular posture of a man who has been caught between 2 powerful wills before and has the scars to show for it. Daenerys looked at Aragorn for a long moment. She was accustomed to men who could not hold her gaze, men who looked away from the silver hair and the violet eyes and the 3 dragons and their weight of Targaryen destiny made manifest. Aragorn looked back at her with those grey eyes and did not look away, and this registered on her face as something she had not expected. Jon Snow tells me you are a king, she said. I am, Aragorn replied. Of what kingdom? Gondor and Arna. A pause. You would not find them on any map in this castle. Daenerys's expression did not change, but something shifted behind her. Eyes, the rapid calculation of a strategic mind processing new information. A king from beyond any known map. An army of tens of thousands, disciplined and battle-hardened, delivered to her doorstep 2 days before the greatest battle in the history of the living world. She was wise enough to know what that was worth. She was also Targaryen enough to know what it would cost her if she appeared to need it. A king without a kingdom, she said. In Westeros, that is a common condition. I have a kingdom, Aragorn said, without heat. I am merely not in it at present. He looked around the great hall, at the Unsullied, at the Targaryen banners, at the controlled precision of everything she had assembled. You have built something impressive here, with considerable cost, I would guess. Everything worth having costs considerably. Yes. He met her eyes again. Which is why I will be direct with you, Your Grace, because I believe you are a person who prefers directness to ceremony when the stakes are sufficient. He gestured slightly northward. What is coming for this castle in 2 days does not care about your claim to the Iron Throne. It does not care about succession or legitimacy or the game your lords play for power. It cares about death. It wants to make everything that breathes into everything that doesn't. A pause. My army and I are here. We did not choose to be here, but we are. We will fight what is coming, because it is the right thing to do and because we have no other choice. In this world we've been dropped into. What I will not do, what my people will not do, is kneel to any throne in exchange for the right to defend innocent lives. The silence in the hall was absolute. Miss Anday kept her face carefully neutral. Grey Worm, standing at the door, did not move a muscle. Jon Snow studied the middle distance with intense concentration. Daenerys looked at Aragorn for a long time. Long enough that the calculation happening behind her eyes was almost visible. Ned Stark's bastard said something similar to me once, she said finally. About bending the knee. And yet you are still talking to him, Aragorn observed. Something crossed Daenerys's face, not quite a smile, not quite irritation, something in the complicated territory between them. She stood and walked down from the dais, which surprised everyone in the room, because Daenerys Targaryen did not generally come down from her dais to meet men who had refused her. She stopped 6 feet from Aragorn and looked up at him. And what passed between them in that moment was the mutual recognition of 2 people who had each carried something unbearably heavy for a very long time. I have dragons, she said. I have an army of the dead sworn to fight until I release them, he replied. And a wizard. Gandalf, who had been following this exchange with the expression of someone watching a chess game being played simultaneously on 2 boards, inclined his head slightly at this description. I also, Daenerys said, have seen enough of this war to know that pride is a luxury the living cannot afford in the face of the dead. She extended her hand, not the gesture of a queen demanding fealty, but something closer to the gesture of a general acknowledging a peer. An alliance between equals until the long night ends. Aragorn looked at her hand, then at her face. Then he took her hand and gripped it, the way soldiers grip each other's hands, at the wrist, with the full weight of meaning behind it. Until the long night ends, he agreed. It was Gimli who broke the tension, in the way that only Gimli could. Right, he said, rubbing his hands together with the satisfaction of a dwarf who had just watched 2 stubborn people avoid a catastrophic waste of everyone's time. Now, someone show me where they keep the ale in this castle, and tell me everything you know about killing dead men, because I have opinions about both subjects and very little time to share them. But it was Gandalf who lingered, as the others moved toward the map table and the planning. That could not be delayed any longer. He lingered because he had felt something during the exchange between Aragorn and Daenerys, not from either of them, but from elsewhere, from the north, from the vast cold presence he had first sensed when they arrived. The Night King had been watching, not through spies, Not through ravens. Through something older and more direct, the psychic current that connected him to every dead thing in his army, extended now like a tendril of frozen attention toward the warmth of Winterfell, toward the new fire that had appeared within it. Gandalf closed his hand around his staff and felt Narya's warmth pulse against his palm in response. The Night King now knew exactly what he was dealing with, and he had been adjusting his plans accordingly for the past several hours. The ravens came at midnight. Not Winterfell's ravens, those were asleep in their cages, or as close to sleep as ravens ever managed, their black eyes half-lidded, their talons wrapped around their perches with the mechanical certainty of creatures that had never needed to worry about what the dark contained. These ravens came from the north, from beyond the wall, from whatever frozen intelligence directed them, and they were wrong in every way that ravens could be wrong. Their eyes were blue, their flight was silent, and they did not land. They circled Winterfell 3 times, high above the walls, visible only because Legolas saw them first and because Legolas's eyes could find a moth in a moonless forest at 100 yards. He watched them circle with an expression of quiet attention that the elves of Middle-earth reserved for things that required careful assessment before any other response. "Message ravens," said Jon Snow, when Legolas pointed them out from the ramparts. "But not yours," Legolas agreed. "They carry no messages. They are watching." "For him," Jon said. "For us," Legolas corrected gently. "He already knows this castle. He is learning us." Below them, in the godswood, the weirwood tree bled red sap into the snow in thin rivulets that had not been there at sundown, and Bran Stark sat before it in his chair with his eyes rolled back to white, traveling the psychic network of the old gods with the particular urgency of a greenseer who has seen something that cannot wait until morning. What Bran saw, he would not fully describe to anyone afterward. He would say only that the Night King's mind was not empty, as some had assumed, that behind the blue eyes and the frozen purpose was something that thought, that planned, that had encountered the army of Middle-earth in Bran's visions and spent the hours since their arrival in a process of strategic recalibration so thorough and so cold that it felt less like thinking and more like weather changing. The Night King had faced dragons before. He had faced Valyrian steel. He had faced the desperation of the living world throwing everything it possessed against the certainty of his advance and finding it insufficient. He had developed, over 10,000 years of patient waiting, a comprehensive understanding of everything the living could bring against him. He had not accounted for a star of fire. He had not accounted for the army of the dead of Dunharrow, dead that were not his, dead that operated outside the psychic network he used to command his whites, dead that he could feel but not reach, like trying to grip smoke. The existence of autonomous dead, dead with their own compact and their own will, created a tactical problem he had never encountered. His whites moved because he moved them. These dead moved because of an oath sworn to a living king. The distinction was philosophically interesting and militarily infuriating. And the fire. The old man in white with the staff that burned from the inside. The Night King had felt R'hlloreth's fire before, had felt Melisandre's power and Thoros of Myr's resurrecting flames, had categorized them correctly as dangerous but manageable. The power of a god whose domain was warmth and light and therefore inherently limited in its application, against something that simply did not fear either. R'hlloreth's fire could hurt his walkers. It could not stop them. This was different. What Gandalf carried was not R'hlloreth's fire. The Night King could feel that clearly, the way a deaf man can feel the vibration of sound through stone. It came from somewhere else, not from this world's theology, not from the blood and iron, magical laws of Westeros and Essos. It came from outside those laws entirely, from a different cosmology with different fundamental principles, and it burned in a register that the Night King did not have 10,000 years of preparation for. This required adjustment. He sent his 3 most elite White Walkers south ahead of the main army, not to attack, not yet, to probe, to test the boundaries of what this new fire could do and what it could not, and to eliminate the army of the dead of Dunharrow if an opportunity presented itself. before the battle began in earnest. Dead that could not be. Controlled were a tactical variable he refused to allow on the battlefield. In the great hall of Winterfell, Gandalf sat alone at the map, table long after the others had gone to rest, or to whatever approximation of rest was available to men 2 days. From the end of everything, he sat with his staff across his knees and his eyes on the fire in the hearth, watching it the way a man watches something he knows is about to become important. Melisandre found him then near the 2nd hour of the morning. She did not speak immediately. She poured 2 cups of wine from the flagon on the table. The good Dornish read that someone had brought up from the cellars in a gesture of either hospitality or black humor, and set one in front of him and kept one for herself, and sat down across the fire from him. You felt it, she said. What he did tonight. The ravens, Gandalf agreed. Yes. And the recalibration. Behind them. He picked up the wine, without drinking it, turning the cup in his hands. He is not simply powerful. He is intelligent. Adaptive. A pause. I have faced intelligent darkness before. It is considerably more dangerous than the mindless kind. R'hllor has shown me this night many times in the flames, Melisandre said. A great darkness. A great fire answering it. She looked at his staff. I thought the fire was Daenerys. Or Jon Snow. The prince that was promised. She was quiet for a moment. I am no longer certain. Prophecy, Gandalf said, with a gentleness that bordered on compassion, has a way of fitting itself to whatever fire is available. Be careful of certainty, my lady. It has ended more battles than cowardice ever did. Melisandre looked at him across the fire for a long time. Then she said something that she had not said to anyone in 40 years of serving R'hllor, with the absolute conviction of the twice faithful. I am afraid, she said. Good, said Gandalf. So am I. He finally drank from the wine. Fear is how you know the stakes are real. The question is what you do with it. He set the cup down and looked back at the fire. Tomorrow we must test what my power can do against his walkers. Before the battle. Before he sends them in numbers we cannot answer. He looked at her. I will need your fire alongside mine. Not because I cannot manage alone, but because 2 fires are harder to extinguish than one. Melisandre straightened. The fear was still there. She would not pretend otherwise to this old man who somehow saw through pretense as easily as he saw through walls. But alongside it, something steadier had appeared. The recognition of purpose. Of use. Where? She asked. The northern gate, Gandalf said. At dawn. He picked up his staff and stood. The Night King is sending scouts. Let us make sure that whatever he learns from them gives him reason to pause. He walked toward the door, and the fire in the hearth burned brighter for a moment after he passed it, as though Narya's proximity had left a residue of warmth in the wood. Melisandre sat alone with her wine and the fire and the fear that had become, in the last hour, the most honest thing she had felt in decades. In the Godswood, Bran Stark's eyes came back to their normal color. He sat in the dark for a long moment, the weirwood's red sap cooling in the snow around him. Then he called for someone to bring him paper and a raven. Not to send a message. To receive one. From a part of his vision he had not yet told anyone about. A part that concerned not the Night King's 3 advance walkers, but something behind them. Something the Night King was using as a weapon he believed no one in Winterfell could anticipate. He had seen, in the weirwood's vision, what the Night King had raised from the frozen earth north of Eastwatch. And it had wings. Dawn came to Winterfell the way dawn came to everything in the long night, reluctantly. Partially, a grey suggestion of light rather than the thing itself, as though the sun had looked at what was happening in the north and decided to keep its distance. The torches on the ramparts burned lower as the grey crept in, and the soldiers of 2 worlds, who had not slept, stood at their posts and watched the tree line and said very little, because there was very little left to say. Gandalf was at the northern gate before the last star faded. He stood in the open ground between the gate and the tree line, alone, his white robes almost luminous in the grey half-light, his staff planted in the frozen earth before him. He had told the knights Watch brothers on the gate to keep. Their arrows narked but not to loose unless he gave a clear signal, which he described as him raising his staff above his head with both hands, a gesture specific enough that there would be no ambiguity about it in the heat of the moment. He had told them this with the calm specificity of a man who has given battle instructions in desperate situations, often enough to know that clarity is the only mercy you can offer frightened soldiers. Melisandre stood 10 feet to his left. She had come at dawn as she said she would, her ruby warm at her throat, her hands already beginning the low murmured invocation that she used to open herself to R'hllor's fire. She did not speak to Gandalf when she arrived. They had said what needed to be said the night before. Now was the time for the thing itself. They felt the White Walkers before they saw them. The temperature dropped, not the ambient cold of the long night, which was already brutal, but something more specific, more intentional. A cold that had direction and purpose. The trees at the tree line frosted over in sequence, left to right, as though something were walking along the edge of the forest, and the forest itself were recoiling from the contact. Then the trees went still, and in the stillness 3 figures stepped out onto the open ground. White Walkers. The Night King's elite, not the rank-and-file commanders who herded whites, but something older and stranger. Their armor a blue-black that seemed to absorb the grey light rather than reflect it, their eyes burning with a cold fire that had no warmth in it whatsoever. They moved with the deliberate, unhurried confidence of beings that have never encountered something they could not simply wait out. They stopped 40 yards away and looked at Gandalf. Gandalf looked back at them. The central walker raised one hand, and the ground between them erupted in a wave of ice that rolled toward Gandalf like a breaking sea. They kind of working that had shattered castle, gates and frozen rivers solid in seconds. It was a probe, not a killing blow. A question asked in the language of power. What are you, and what can you do? Gandalf answered in kind. He raised his staff and drove its base into the ground. And Narya's fire answered him. Not the small controlled light he used for illumination or comfort, but the full voice of the ring, the fire that certain had given him at the Grey Havens, with the words that it might rekindle hearts in a world that was growing cold. The light that erupted from the staff's tip was not orange. It was white, the white of something far older than flame, and it hit the ice wave with a crack that shook the ramparts of Winterfell, and sent the knights, Watch brothers staggering backward from the gate. The ice didn't melt. It shattered, exploded outward in a radius of crystalline fragments that scattered across the frozen ground like broken glass, and where they fell the ground steamed faintly in the cold air, as though the earth itself were exhaling relief. The 3 White Walkers were still. Then, from Gandalf's left, Melisandre raised her hands and spoke the words of R'hllor, fire in the old Valyrian tongue, that the Lord of Light's faithful had used since before the doom. Her fire was different from Gandalf's, warmer, redder, mortal in its urgency in a way that Narya's ancient power was not, but it was real fire, genuine and powerful, and it hit the leftmost walker with a force that drove it back 3 steps on the frozen ground. The walker did not fall, but it stepped back. In 10,000 years of the long night, the White Walkers had not stepped back from fire. The 3 of them looked at each other with whatever passed for communication between beings of ancient frozen intelligence. Then they looked at Gandalf again, and this time there was something in their burning blue eyes that had not been there before. Not fear, beings that old did not fear in the way that living things feared, but assessment, recalibration, the cold intelligence of creatures that had just learned something about their enemy that changed their tactical situation in ways they needed to report back. They turned and walked back into the tree line. On the ramparts, a Night's Watch brother let out a long shaking breath. Then another. Then someone laughed. The slightly hysterical laugh of a man who has been holding his fear at a very high tension and just felt the string release by a fraction. Jon Snow had watched from the gate. He came out now onto the open ground, Ghost at his heel, and stopped beside Gandalf. The wizard was leaning on his staff with both hands, his head slightly bowed, his breathing controlled but deliberate. The breathing of a man who has expended something significant and is taking a moment to acknowledge the cost. You drove them back, Jon said. I gave them information, Gandalf corrected, without looking up. Which was the intention? They will report to the Night King that my fire can break his ice workings and that ruleress. Fire can affect his walkers. Physically. He straightened. He will adjust his approach accordingly. That doesn't sound like a victory. It is not a victory. It is a negotiation. Gandalf looked at the tree line where the walkers had disappeared. We have shown him our strength. He will now show us his response to it. Better to know his response now, in daylight, such as it is, than to discover it in the middle of the battle tonight. As if in answer to this, Bran Stark's raven arrived. Not the message Bran had prepared in the Godswood. That one had been sent to Jon. This was a second raven, written in haste. The letters uneven with urgency. Jon read it. His face went through several things in quick succession. Comprehension. Horror. The particular stillness of a man forcing himself to think clearly in the face of something that made clear thinking very difficult. He handed it to Gandalf without speaking. Gandalf read, The Night King has raised Viserion from beyond Eastwatch. He brings a second dead dragon. I have seen it in the weirwood. It breathes not fire but ice. He means to use it against the walls while his army holds our forces in the field. He knows we have no counter for two. Gandalf folded the note carefully and put it inside his robe. He looked north. He was quiet for a long moment. The kind of quiet that was not absence of thought but the opposite. Thought moving very fast through a mind accustomed to speed. 2 dead dragons, Jon said. Daenerys has 2 living ones, Gandalf said. Drogon and Rhaegal against Viserion and... Not and, Gandalf said. He has raised one. The message says one. He looked at Jon. But you are right to think about the second. He turned back toward the castle. We need to speak with Aragorn. Immediately. And with the army of the dead of Dun Harrow. He was already walking, his robes trailing across the frost. The Night King's adjustment to our presence has been to bring air, power against walls he expected, to breach on the ground. He is trying to remove the walls from the equation entirely. Can the army of the dead fight a dragon? Gandalf stopped walking for just a moment. I genuinely do not know, he said, with the honest uncertainty of a very wise man, confronting a genuinely novel problem. But I intend to find out before tonight, because tonight we will not have the luxury of not knowing. He pushed open the gate of Winterfell and walked through, and the ravens on the ramparts watched him go with their black eyes. And somewhere to the north, beyond where any living eye could see, the dead dragon, Viserion turned his great ruined head toward the warmth of Winterfell, and opened his blue eyes wider in the dark. The war council that assembled in Winterfell's great hall 2 hours before sunset was the strangest gathering in the castle's 8,000-year history, and Winterfell had hosted some genuinely strange gatherings. Jon Snow stood at the head of the map table with the particular expression of a man who has died once and found the experience clarifying. Daenerys sat to his right. Drogon's distant presence felt by everyone in the room as a kind of atmospheric pressure, the awareness of something enormous and dangerous choosing, for the moment, to be still. Aragorn stood across the table with Legolas and Gimli flanking him in the configuration that Jon had already come to recognize as their default geometry in moments of crisis. Gandalf stood at the table's end, nearest the fire, his staff leaning against his chair and his hands flat on the map. Melisandre stood in the shadows near the wall, not excluded, but choosing the periphery with the instinct of someone who has learned that the center of rooms can be dangerous. Sir Davos was there, because Davos was always there. His presence the quiet anchor of practical intelligence that kept every council Jon had ever attended from floating off into the realm of the theoretical. Grey Worm stood at the door. Eowyn of Rohan had asked to attend and Aragorn had said yes, without consulting anyone. which had produced a moment of tension with Daenerys, that had been resolved by the simple fact that neither woman was willing to waste time on it when the dead were 2 hours away. Eowyn had looked at Daenerys across the table with the frank assessment of a shield maiden, evaluating a fellow warrior, and Daenerys had looked back with the equally frank assessment of a queen deciding whether this woman was useful. They had arrived at a silent mutual understanding that had nothing to do with liking each other and everything to do with professional respect. "The Night King brings a dead dragon," Jon said, without preamble. "Viserion. He was killed north of the wall and raised. He breathes ice, not fire. Blue flame that freezes everything it touches." He looked at Daenerys, because this was her dragon they were discussing, and the courtesy of acknowledgement cost him nothing. She met his eyes and said nothing and gave him permission with her silence to continue. "He will use Viserion against the walls while his army engages our forces in the field. The walls come down, the dead flood the courtyard, and the battle becomes a slaughter." "Drogon and regal," Daenerys said. Her voice was controlled, in the way that very deep water is controlled, the surface still while considerable forces moved beneath. "They can counter Viserion in the air. Against a dead dragon that does not tire, does not fear, and is controlled by the most powerful sorcerer in the history of this world," Gandalf said carefully, not as contradiction but as completion. "Your dragons are stronger, fresher, but the Night King will be directing Viserion with his full attention and his full power. This will not be a simple contest of fire against ice." "What do you suggest?" Daenerys asked him. "I suggest we use Viserion's presence as an opportunity rather than treating it as purely a problem." Gandalf's finger moved on the map. "The Night King will be managing Viserion directly during the battle. His attention will be divided between the air and the ground assault. Divided attention is a vulnerability." He looked at Aragorn. "Which brings me to what I need from your dead." Aragorn had been listening, with the focused stillness of a commander, processing tactical information. "Tell me." "The army of the dead of Dunharrow cannot be controlled by the Night King," Gandalf said. "They exist outside his psychic network. He can feel them but cannot reach them. This means he cannot raise them if they fall, and it means they can move through his white army without the whites. Instinctive response to the living." He paused. "I want to use them as a deep strike force. Send them through the white army while the main battle holds the Night King's attention on the walls. Push them all the way through and into the Night King's command position. Not to kill him." He looked around the table. "I do not believe they can kill him, but they can force him to divide his attention 3 ways: Viserion, the ground assault, and the dead that are not his own pressing against his command position from the inside." "3-way division," Aragorn said. "At which point," Gandalf continued, "someone needs to reach him directly." The silence that followed. This had the quality of everyone in the room doing the same calculation simultaneously, and arriving at the same answer and not being happy about it. Jon Snow touched Longclaw's hilt without appearing to notice he was doing it. "Dragonglass and Valyrian steel," he said. "Those are the only things that kill White Walkers." "In your world," Gandalf said. He was looking at the fire. "I am not certain they are the only things that kill. The Night King specifically." He turned to face the table. "I have been considering what we know of how he was made. Bran showed me, through the Weirwood network, with Bran's assistance translating the vision, the original working. The children of the forest. The dragonglass through the heart." He paused. "He was made by dragonglass, and I wonder if what unmakes him might need to be something that carries the opposite principle. Not just the physical material, but the intent behind it. Life against death. Not a weapon, but a choice." "You're describing Arya," Jon said quietly. Arya Stark had not been at the council table. She was somewhere in Winterfell's walls, doing what Arya Stark did, which was move through spaces unseen and prepare herself for violence with the focused calm of a faceless man who had decided to remain herself. Gandalf had not met her yet, but he had heard about her from Jon, and from Bran's translation of the Weirwood visions, and he had formed an opinion. I am describing whoever reaches him, Gandalf said carefully. But yes, someone with the specific combination of training, weapon, and something the Night King does not know how to account for. He looked at Jon. He knows about Valyrian steel. He has faced it. He will have a response prepared for it. A pause. He does not know about a girl who learned to be no one and chose to be someone. Gimli, who had been uncharacteristically quiet throughout this council, spoke up. And what about while all of this is happening? While the dead press the walls and the dragons fight in the sky and you're dead. Men push through the White Army. Who holds the line so none of it collapses before the knife reaches him? We do, said Eowyn. Every eye in the room went to her. She was looking at the map with the expression of someone who has found the place on it, where they are meant to stand. The Rohirrim hold the left flank, she said. We have always held flanks. It is what we do. She looked at Grey Worm. Your Unsullied hold the right. The line between us is where the dead will concentrate their heaviest push, because the line between two forces is always where a disciplined enemy probes for weakness. She looked at Aragorn. Gondis infantry takes the center and holds it no matter what happens, on the flanks or in the air or anywhere else. Aragorn looked at her for a moment with something that was not quite pride and not quite grief but occupied the complicated space between them that exists, between people who have fought too many battles together. No matter what happens, he confirmed. Daenerys stood. The action brought the room's attention to her with the gravity of a woman who had learned exactly how to use the space she occupied. I will take Drogon into the air the moment Viserion appears. Rhaegal follows. She looked at Jon. You ride Rhaegal. I know, Jon said. I need you in the air, not on the ground. I know, he said again. He did not look happy about it. Jon Snow's instinct was always to be where the dying was thickest, on the ground, with his sword in his hand and his people around him. But he was capable of overriding instinct with necessity. It was one of the things that made him worth following. Gandalf straightened from the map. The fire behind him threw his shadow long across the floor. And in that moment, in that light, he looked less like an old man leaning on a staff and more like what he actually was. A Maya, one of the order of beings sent into the world to contest the power of darkness, wearing age and limitation, like a costume over something considerably older and more fundamental. Then we are agreed, he said. Let us spend what time remains making certain every soldier in this castle knows their position and their purpose. He looked around the table one final time. The Night King has never faced a battle he did not design. Tonight, for the first time in 10,000 years, he faces one he did not plan for. A pause. Let us make certain he regrets the difference. Outside, the grey light of the truncated day was failing. The long night was deepening. And from the north, carried on a wind that smelled of nothing living, came the distant sound of the dead beginning to march. The dead came with the dark. There was no trumpet call, no war drum, no the theatrical announcement of an army that needed its enemy to know it was coming. The Night King's host simply materialized, out of the blackness to the north, like a tide coming in, first a sound, the grinding shuffle of 10,000 feet on frozen ground, then a shape, the vast dark mass of the dead moving as one organism across the plain toward Winterfell's walls, and then the cold, the specific directional cold of the Night King's presence, pushing ahead of his army like a bow wave. On the walls, torches guttered and died. The trebuchets fired first, great arcs of flaming pitch that illuminated the dead in strobing orange light as they fell, revealing a host so vast that the firelight could not find its edges. The dead stretching back into the darkness beyond sight, beyond counting. A number that the mind rejected and the body understood only as pure animal terror. The Dothraki had ridden out first, as they had before, their arcs blazing with Melissandra's fire, and like before, The fire had lasted only moments before the dark swallowed them. But this time something different happened in the dark. The army of the dead of Dunharrow was already moving. Aragorn had sent them out an hour before the battle began, while the Night King's attention was still. Organizing his advance, sent them north, along the eastern tree line, moving through the dark with the silence of the already dead, passing through the Night King's scouting whites, without triggering the alarm that living soldiers would have raised. They moved like smoke moves, with direction but without mass, and the whites they passed through shuddered faintly at the contact but did not respond, because the Night King's psychic network registered them as present, but could not categorize them, could not command them, and could not warn him about them the way it warned him about the living. By the time the main assault reached Winterfell's walls, the army of Dunharrow was already 3 miles behind the Night King's front line and pushing deeper. On the left flank, the Rohirrim held. Eowyn led them personally, which Aragorn had not argued with, because arguing with Eowyn about where she intended to stand in a battle was an exercise he had learned was not worth the time. She rode a grey horse that had been found in Winterfell stables, not Windfola, not the horse she had ridden onto the Polenna, but a horse that responded to her hands, with the particular sensitivity of an animal that understands it is being ridden by someone who knows exactly what they are doing. The Rohirrim around her were adapted to the cold now, not comfortable in it, not happy about it, but adapted the way soldiers adapt to conditions that are trying to kill them, with a kind of furious practical acceptance. The dead hit the left flank in a wave and the Rohirrim hit back, and the sound of it was enormous. Not the clean clash of organized armies but the wet, grinding cacophony of a battle fought at close quarters against enemies that did not flinch and did not retreat and got back up. The Rohirrim's horses, trained for cavalry charges against living enemies, struggled against opponents that smelled wrong and moved wrong and kept reaching for them with frozen hands after taking wounds that would have stopped anything alive. Eowyn's sword moved with the precision of a woman who had spent her life preparing for exactly this, the cold clarity of purpose that she had worn since childhood like a second skin. She did not think about the faces of the whites, what they had been before the Night King claimed them, whose brothers and fathers and children they had started as. She thought about the sword and the angle and the next target, and she held the line because the line could not be allowed to break. On the right flank, Grey Worm and the Unsullied formed their lock shield configuration, with the geometric perfection of soldiers for whom discipline was not a value but a physical reflex. They did not rout. They did not break. When the whites pressed them back, they stepped back in unison and closed the gap and pressed forward again, their spears working in the mechanical rhythm of men who had been trained since childhood to be exactly this, a wall of controlled violence that did not require morale, because it had replaced morale with something more reliable. In the center, Gondor's infantry held the ground that Eowyn had identified as the killing point. Aragorn was in the center. He was always in the center. Anduril moved in the firelight with the particular quality of a blade that had been reforged from something broken and made better in the reforging, its edge finding the gaps in the dead with the efficiency of long practice. Aragorn himself moving through the press of the battle with the controlled violence of a ranger who had spent decades fighting in places where making a mistake meant dying, alone in the dark where no one would find you. Beside him, Gimli fought with both axes in a state that could only be described as professional joy, the dwarf's particular gift for close quarters battle finding its fullest expression in a press where his height was an advantage, rather than a limitation, where he could move under the reach of the dead and come up inside their guard with the focused brutality of a craftsman who takes his work seriously. He was counting. Of course he was counting. 43, he announced, driving an axe through a white's skull with the satisfaction of a point made in an ongoing argument. I'm not competing, Aragorn said, cutting down 2 with a single sweep and stepping over them without breaking stride. 44, Gimli said. Above them, the sky split open. Drogon came from the south with Daenerys on his back, his wingspan throwing a shadow across the battlefield that the dead below did not look up at, because the dead did not look up at shadows, and his roar hit the night air like a physical object, something that could be felt in the chest at a quarter mile. Jon Snow came behind him on Rhaegal, lower and faster. Rhaegal's green-black scales, almost invisible against the dark sky until the fire came. Viserion appeared from the north. The dead dragon was wrong in every way. That Drogon and Rhaegal were right. The same species, the same scale, the same fundamental architecture, but inhabited by something that had taken the living creature and kept the body while removing everything that had made it alive. His eyes burned blue in the dark. His wings moved with mechanical precision, rather than the organic rhythm of a living dragon's flight. And when he opened his mouth, what came out was not fire. The ice-blue flame hit Winterfell's eastern wall, and the stone did not burn. It froze. A section of parapet 30 feet wide went from ancient grey granite to something crystalline and rigid in 3 seconds. And then the frozen stone shattered under its own brittleness, and a section of Winterfell's wall that had stood for 8,000 years came down in a cascade of ice-coated rubble. The whites poured through the gap. On Drogon's back, Daenerys turned her dragon toward Viserion with the focused fury of a woman looking at the corpse of something she had loved. And Drogon answered her rage with his fire, a full sustained blast that hit Viserion broadside and did damage, real damage, tearing through dead scales and dead flesh. But Viserion did not veer away, because Viserion did not feel pain, and the Night King's will held him on his heading with an iron certainty that had nothing to do with the dragon's own survival instinct. Jon brought Rhaegal up from below, going for Viserion's underbelly, the classic dragon fighting angle that the Targaryens had used against each other in the Dance of Dragons, the approach that maximized damage and minimized exposure. Rhaegal's fire found purchase on Viserion's exposed belly, and the dead dragon screamed, a sound unlike any living dragon's roar, something that registered in the human nervous system as fundamentally wrong, and rolled away from the attack. But in rolling, Viserion's ice breath swept across the courtyard below, and 20 soldiers of Gondor, who had been holding the breach in the wall, went still and rigid where they stood. Aragorn saw it from 50 yards away. He did not allow himself to stop. He could not afford to stop. He closed Andril's guard against a white's reaching hands and drove it through and kept moving, because the line had to hold, and the line was him and they, people around him, and if he stopped moving, the line stopped, and the line could not stop. In the sky, the 2 living dragons and the one dead one wheeled and struck and wheeled again, and the Night King, on the ground somewhere north of the breach in the wall, divided his attention between Viserion and the army of Dun Harrow pressing toward him through the dark. And in that division, in that fractional reduction of his total focus, the psychic grip on his white army flickered, just for a moment, just long enough for Legolas, standing on the intact section of the western wall with an arrow narked and the wind in his hair, to notice that the whites in the courtyard below had hesitated. He filed this information away with elven precision and sent his arrow through the eye of the nearest white and reached for the next one. And in the crypts beneath Winterfell, moving through the darkness with a blade in each hand and the face of no one in particular, and the purpose of someone who has been preparing for this moment without knowing it for years, Arya Stark heard the wall come down and began to move. The breach in the eastern wall had become a mouth. The dead poured through it with the mindless hydraulic pressure of water, finding a hole, not tactical, not organized, simply the application of infinite mass to finite space. The whites driven forward by the Night King's will in waves that did not thin, because there was no end to the waves. Gondor's infantry had formed a crescent around the interior of the breach, holding the shape with desperate discipline, men dying on their feet and being replaced by the men behind them in a rotation that could not last, because nothing that cost this much could last. Aragorn was at the crescent center point, which was the place where the pressure was greatest, and therefore the place where he needed to be. Anduril was no longer clean. It had not been clean for an hour. Coated with the dark matter that passed for blood in the Night King's dead, and Aragorn moved. It with the economy of a man who understands that the difference between winning and losing a sustained battle of this kind is not heroics but efficiency. Every motion counted. Nothing was wasted. He had been fighting since the wall came down, and he would keep fighting until something stopped him. And very few things in two worlds had proven capable of stopping him. Gimli was at his right shoulder. The dwarf had long since stopped counting. The whites pressing through. The breach suddenly lurched, a ripple of disruption moving through them from the outside in, as though something had struck the back of the mass and the impact were traveling forward. The whites at the breach's edges stumbled, lost their coordinated pressure, began moving at cross purposes, with the fluid wrongness of puppets whose strings had been momentarily tangled. The army of Dunharrow had reached the Night King's position. Aragorn felt it before he understood it, the fractional reduction in the whites, coordinated will, the hairline crack in the absolute certainty of their advance. He had felt something similar once before, in a different world, in a different dark, when Frodo had put on the ring at the edge of the fire and the eye had turned. That moment of divided attention from a controlling intelligence, brief and precious and not to be wasted. Push, he said. Gondis infantry pushed. They pushed with everything they had left, which was less than it had been an hour ago but more than it should have been. The way soldiers in desperate positions sometimes find reserves that have no rational explanation, reserves made of stubbornness and grief and the refusal to let the people beside them die without company. The crescent straightened. The dead at the breach stumbled back. For 30 seconds, Winterfell's courtyard breathed. In those 30 seconds, Arya Stark moved through the dead. She had come up from the crypts through a passage that only Starks knew about, a route through the castles. Oldest bones that Bran had described to her in the hour before the battle with the careful specificity of a greenseer who understands that the difference between a person reaching their destination and not reaching it is often a single correct turn in the dark. She had the Valyrian steel dagger in her left hand, and a long knife in her right, and she moved through the press of the dead with the technique that Jaqen H'ghar had spent years installing. In her, the ability to not be where people were looking, to occupy the spaces between attention, to be present and invisible simultaneously. The dead did not see her because they were not looking for her. They were looking for the living, for the warm and the breathing, for the things that the Night Kings will directed them toward. Arya moved like cold water between them, touching nothing, disturbing nothing, a shadow in a world made of shadows. She found Gandalf first, because Gandalf was impossible to miss even in the dark. The wizard had positioned himself at the interior base of the breach, below the crescent of Gondis infantry, and he was doing something that Arya had no framework for, standing, with both hands on his staff and his eyes closed and his lips moving in words she could not hear, while the light of Narya pulsed outward from the staff's tip in rhythmic waves that washed across the whites nearest him and made them stagger and slow, not stopping them, slowing them, buying the infantry the fractional advantage of enemies who moved at 90% of their normal, terrible speed rather than 100. He opened his eyes when she reached him. He looked at her with those sharp eyes and said nothing for a moment, assessing in the way that very old and very perceptive minds assess, quickly, completely, with none of the condescension that most adults brought to the examination of a girl who looked barely old enough to carry the blade she was carrying. The weirwood showed you to me, he said. Not a greeting, a statement of established fact. Bran told me where he'd be, she said. The Night King. Where he's standing. I know where he's standing, Gandalf said. The army of Dunharrow found him 10 minutes ago. He is 200 yards north of the breach, outside the walls, directing from elevation, a rise in the ground that gives him sight lines across the entire battlefield. He paused. He is occupied. 3 ways. Viserion, the Dunharrow dead pressing his position. and whatever he is doing to hold his grip on the white army despite the interference. Another pulse of Narya's light pushed outward, and a cluster of whites stumbled back from the infantry line. He cannot add a fourth. Unless he sees me coming, Arya said. Unless he sees you coming, Gandalf agreed. He looked at her with an expression that contained several things simultaneously: respect, sorrow, someone sending another person into danger they cannot share. You have faced death before. I am death, she said. Not arrogance. Fact. The faceless men had spent years trying to make her into a vessel for death, and she had refused and taken what they offered and turned it into something the many-faced god had not anticipated. Gandalf almost smiled. Then go, he said. I will give you as much time as I can. When I raise my staff with both hands above my head. I'll be gone by then, she said. She was already moving. Above the walls, the dragon battle had reached its crisis point. Drogon and Rhaegal had worked Viserion into a position between them, the tactics of experienced predators, cornering something dangerous, using the dead dragon's inability to adapt its approach as a weapon against it. Daenerys drove Drogon into a sustained assault from the north while Jon brought Rhaegal from the south and below, and Viserion, caught between two angles of attack with the Night King's attention divided, took damage it could not compensate for. Rhaegal's fire tearing through the junction of dead wing and dead body with structural finality. Viserion's left wing failed. The dead dragon did not cry out. It had no pain to cry out from. But the sound of the wing's structural collapse was enormous. A wet mechanical tearing that cut through the battle noise below. And Viserion fell from the sky, with the helpless tumbling asymmetry of something that has lost the ability to fly and retained the ability to be very large and very heavy. He hit the ground north of the walls with an impact that shook the frozen earth for 100 yards in every direction and through the Night King's whites. Nearest the impact point off their feet, the Night King turned toward the sound. In turning, he showed Arya Stark his back. She was already through the gap in the wall, through a crack in the rubble that a larger person could not have used, moving across the open ground, north of Winterfell with the absolute silence of someone who learned silence from people who had been practicing it for millennia. The Night King stood on his rise 40 yards away, his attention split between the fallen Viserion, the pressing Dunharrow dead, the battle at the walls, and the whites' fraying coordination, and his back was to her. 30 yards. On the walls, Legolas saw her, elven eyes in the dark, tracking the one moving thing that moved, differently from everything else, not the shambling purpose of the dead or the desperate organized violence of the living, but something specific and intentional. A line drawn through the chaos from one point to another. He did not raise an alarm. He understood what he was seeing. He knocked an arrow and aimed at the nearest walker flanking the Night King's position, waiting. 20 yards. The Night King went still. Not the stillness of reaction, not the sudden freeze of a creature that has heard something behind it. The deliberate stillness of something that had felt a change in the psychic landscape around it and was assessing the source. His head began to turn, slowly, with the terrible unhurried certainty of something that has never in 10,000 years encountered a threat it could not see coming. 10 yards. Legolas released. His arrow took the flanking walker through the throat, not a killing shot. Not aimed to kill, aimed to distract, to pull the walker's attention, and threw it a fraction of the Night King's peripheral awareness. The Night King's head completed its turn. He looked directly at Arya Stark. For one eternal second they faced each other across 5 yards of frozen ground, the oldest thing in the world and the girl who had learned to be no one and chosen to remain herself. His blue eyes met her brown ones, and what passed between them in that second was not fear on either side but the absolute mutual recognition of a confrontation that had been inevitable from the moment she was born into the world that needed her. His hand came up. She dropped the Valyrian steel dagger. left her left hand and caught in her right. As she fell, the same transfer. She had performed. In the great hall of Winterfell. Once before. The move that Bran had given her the weapon for without knowing. In that moment what he was giving it for. She came up inside his guard with the blade already moving. And she drove it into the Night King with everything she had. Not just the physical force of a trained killer's strike, but the full weight of everything she had survived to reach this moment. The long road from Winterfell to Braavos and back. The faces she had worn and discarded and the face she had kept. The Night King's eyes widened. He shattered. Not fell. Not died in any conventional sense. Shattered. The way the ice wall had shattered under Gandalf's fire. The way frozen things shatter when the principle that holds them together is suddenly and completely removed. He came apart from the point of impact outward, in a cascade of ice and cold and the release of 10,000 years of compressed terrible will. And the sound of it was like every silence breaking at once. Across the battlefield, the whites stopped. Every single one of them. Simultaneously, with the completeness of candles being snuffed by a single breath, the coordinated cessation of 10,000 moving bodies. The collapse of the psychic network that had animated them. The return of death to its proper condition of stillness. They fell where they stood, and the sound of them falling was like rain. Like the first rain after a drought. So long that people had forgotten what rain sounded like. Gondis infantry stood in the silence with their weapons raised and nothing left to use them on. Gimli looked around at the fallen dead. He looked at Aragorn. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Right, he said. So that's done then. In the sky, Viserion went still on the ground where he had fallen. The blue fading from his eyes, and became simply a dead dragon, enormous and sad and no longer terrible. Drogon and Rhaegal circled above the battlefield, with the restless energy of creatures that had been fighting, and now had nothing to fight, their fire dimming to smoke in the cold air. Arya Stark stood where the Night King had been and looked at the frost on her hands and said nothing. Around her, the long night was ending. Dawn came to Winterfell for the first time in what felt like years. Not the reluctant grey suggestion of light. That had passed for dawn during the long night's tenure, real dawn. The kind that meant something. The kind that arrived with colour. Rose and gold on the eastern horizon. Spreading across a sky that had forgotten it was capable of this. The light moving across the frozen plain. North of Winterfell and finding the fallen dead and the broken wall and the living people standing among all of it, and illuminating them with the particular generosity of a sunrise that understands it has been missed. The soldiers of two worlds stood in that light and did not speak for a long time. There was too much to say and the light was too new and the silence of 10,000 fallen whites was its own kind of overwhelming, the sudden absence of something vast and terrible that had pressed against the world so long that its absence felt structurally significant, like removing a load-bearing wall and discovering that the building still stood. Arya Stark had not moved from where the Night King had shattered. She stood in the frost, with the Valyrian steel dagger still in her hand and her face turned toward the eastern light, and her expression was something that the people who knew her best, Jon, Sansa, Bran in his weirwood visions, would have recognized as the particular stillness that followed the completion of something she had carried for so long it had become part of her weight. She was not celebrating. She was not grieving. She was simply present in the moment after, which was its own country and required its own adjustment. Jon Snow found her there. He had landed Rhaegal in the courtyard and left the dragon to his own devices. Rhaegal was exhausted, his scales scorched in places from the proximity of Viserion's ice breath, but alive, gloriously and improbably alive, and walked through the fallen dead to reach his sister. He stood beside her and did not say anything useful because there was nothing useful to say, and they stood together in the new light the way Starks had always stood together in hard moments, shoulder to shoulder, looking at the same horizon. Aragorn found them there. He came with Andril sheathed, and his face carrying the particular Exhaustion of a commander who has held a line that very nearly did not hold. The kind of tired that goes deeper than the body. He stopped a respectful distance away and waited until Jon turned before speaking. "Your sister," he said to Jon, though he was looking at Arya. "She did what armies could not." "She usually does," Jon said. Aragorn looked at Arya directly. "In my world," he said, "there are songs for what you did tonight. Long songs that people will still be singing 1,000 years from now." Arya looked at him with those dark eyes that had seen too much and chosen to keep looking anyway. "I don't need songs," she said. "No," Aragorn agreed. "But the world needs them, so that people remember it was possible." He held her gaze for a moment longer, then nodded once, not a bow, not the deference of a lesser to a greater, but the acknowledgement of one warrior recognizing another across the uncrossable distance of entirely different lives. Then he turned and walked back toward the castle. The council that assembled in Winterfell's great hall that morning had a different quality from every council that had preceded it. The desperate urgency was gone, replaced by something more complicated. The particular complexity of people who have survived together and must now figure out what survival means in practical terms. The army of Dunharrow stood in the courtyard in the new light, and Aragorn walked among them with the deliberate awareness of a man approaching a debt long owed. They had fought. They had pressed through the night. King's host and reached his position, and held his attention, divided at the critical moment, and in doing so they had completed what their oath required. They had fought for their king until the battle was won. He stopped in the center of their formation, and looked at the translucent faces around him, men who had waited in the mountain for thousands of years for this release, men whose guilt had calcified into something beyond shame, into simple waiting. He had promised them this. He had always intended to keep the promise. "You have kept your oath," he said. "The debt is paid. I release you." The army of Dunharrow dissolved in the morning light. Not dramatically, not with sound or fire, or any of the theatrical trappings that the living world used to mark significant moments. They simply became less present, and then less present again, and then they were gone. And the courtyard was emptier and quieter, and somewhere, in whatever place existed for things that had finished their long waiting, 10,000 dead men finally rested. Gimli watched them go with an expression that he would have described, if pressed, as professional respect. "Good soldiers," he said to Legolas, who stood beside him. "Yes," Legolas agreed. "Didn't complain once." "They were dead, Gimli." "Even so." Inside the great hall, the political reality of the morning after was already assembling itself, with the grim persistence of political realities everywhere. Daenerys sat at the head of the table with the focused attention of a queen who has just won the most important battle in the history of her claim and is thinking clearly about what comes next. Jon sat to her right. Sansa Stark, who had survived the battle in the crypts and emerged into the new light with the particular composure of a woman who has been through too much to be surprised by survival, sat across from him. Gandalf sat at the tables, and with a cup of something warm and his staff leaning against the wall, and his eyes were on the fire, and he was thinking about the rift. Melisandre had spent the morning hours in the Godswood, alone with the weirwood tree and whatever conversation she was having with Law in the aftermath of a night that had rewritten everything she thought she understood about the Lord of Light's plans. When she came to the great hall, she looked different, not younger, not older, but changed in the way that people are, changed when a certainty they have carried for decades is replaced by something more honest and considerably less comfortable. She sat down across from Gandalf and did not speak immediately, and Gandalf did not press her. "The rift will reopen," she said finally. She had seen it in the flames that morning, not with the prophetic certainty that she had once brought to her visions, but with the careful qualified reading of a woman who has learned to distinguish between what the fire shows and what she wants it to mean. 3 days, perhaps 4. The same mechanism that brought your army here will reverse itself. Gandalf nodded slowly. He had felt this too, Narya's awareness of the dimensional pressure changing, the rift that had deposited them in this world, beginning the long slow process of correcting itself. Then we have 3 days, Aragorn said. He had come in quietly and taken a seat without ceremony, the way he always moved through rooms, present without announcing his presence, there before you noticed him arriving. 3 days, Daenerys said. She looked at him across the table with the same frank assessment she had brought to their first meeting, but different now, not the assessment of a queen measuring a potential rival, but of a leader measuring a peer with whom she has shared something that most people never share. What will you do with them? Help rebuild the wall, Aragorn said simply. Gondor has engineers. My people know stone. He looked at Sansa. If you'll have them. Sansa looked at him with those careful, stark eyes that had learned to see past surface gestures to their intention beneath them. The North accepts the help, she said. And then, with the ghost of something that was not quite a smile but occupied the same neighborhood, and thanks for it. Gandalf rose from the table. He walked to the fire and stood before it with his hands clasped behind his back, and for a moment the only sound in the hall was the crackle of burning wood and the distant noise of the living world outside beginning, the long work of continuing. This world will remember this night, he said, to the fire as much as to the room. Not because of the scale of the victory, though the scale was considerable, but because of what made it possible. He turned to face the table. 2 worlds, entirely different, in their principles, and their histories and their ways of understanding power, found enough common ground to stand in a line together against something that neither could have stopped alone. He looked at Arya, who had come in and sat at the tables, far end with a cup of water and the quiet self-containment of a person who has done the thing that needed doing, and is not interested in discussing it. And a girl with a knife did what dragons and armies, and 10,000 years of darkness, could not undo. Arya looked at him. Are all wizards this dramatic? Gandalf considered this with apparent seriousness. The good ones, he said, tend to be, yes. The laughter that moved around the table was tired and genuine, and human in the specific way that laughter after survival always is. They sound of people who have looked at the worst thing and found themselves still capable of the best thing, still capable of this small warm, ordinary miracle of finding something funny in the ruins of the terrible. Outside, Winterfell's people were beginning to move through the fallen dead, beginning the grim necessary work of the morning after. The trebuchets sat cooling on the walls. The breach in the eastern wall gaped at the new sky. Rhaegal and Drogon rested in the courtyard with the exhausted dignity of creatures that have done what they were made to do. And in the godswood, the weirwood tree stood, with its red eyes open and its red sap, cooling in the frost of a morning that had not been guaranteed. And the old gods, whatever they were, whatever they had always been, watched the living world go about it surviving, with the patient ancient attention of things that have been watching long enough to know that surviving is always the beginning of the next story, never the end of it. 3 days later, the rift opened. Aragorn stood before it with Legolas and Gimli and their surviving soldiers of Gondor and Rohan, all of them carrying the particular weight of people returning from somewhere that has changed them. The rift was exactly where Melisandre had said it would be, north of Winterfell, in the open ground where the dead had marched, the air tearing itself apart in a shimmer of dimensional pressure that smelled, faintly, of the Pelennor fields they had been pulled from. Jon Snow was there to see them off. Daenerys stood back, at a respectful distance, present but not intruding. The instinct of a queen understanding when a moment belonged to soldiers and not to rulers. Sansa stood beside her with Arya at her shoulder, the 3 of them making a line that was its own kind of statement. Aragorn turned to Jon. They looked at each other across the distance of everything they had survived together and everything that lay between them. Still, different worlds, different histories, The uncrossable fact of who they each were and where they each belonged. You would have been a good king, Aragorn said. In any world. Jon Snow looked at him with grey eyes that had seen too much and carried it anyway. So would you, he said. You are one. Aragorn almost smiled. He gripped Jon's hand at the wrist. The soldier's grip, and Jon gripped back. And for a moment they held the weight of what they had shared between them. Then Aragorn turned to the rift. Behind him, the armies of Middle-earth followed their king into the shimmer, and the light and the distance, between worlds, and the rift sealed behind them with a sound, like ice breaking on a river in the first true thaw of spring. Winterfell stood in the silence. The long night was over. The dawn that broke over Winterfell on the morning, after the army of Middle-earthers. Departure was the kind of dawn that becomes a fixed point in a people's memory, the before and after around which everything else is organized. Old men and women would spend the rest of their lives dividing time into what happened before the night the dead came with an army from another world, and what happened after the girl with the knife ended it. The stories spread the way stories spread in Westeros, by raven and by mouth, distorted at every telling into something slightly larger and slightly less precise than the truth, which is to say into something that captured the truth more accurately than the facts alone ever could. Maestus wrote careful accounts that dismissed the army of Dunharrow as mass hallucination, and categorized Gandalf's fire as an undocumented application of existing Valyrian sorcery, because that is what Maestus do with things that do not fit their chains. The North remembered differently. The North always did. They remembered the old man in white who stood between the walls and the dark and drove 3 White Walkers back with fire that had no name in any Westerosi tongue. They remembered the king from no known kingdom who held the breach with his people and asked nothing in return and helped rebuild the wall before the rift took him home. They remembered the dwarf who laughed while he fought the dead, and the elf who could see in the dark, and the woman of Rohan who held the left flank when the left flank should have broken. Most of all they remembered Arya Stark, who had always been one of their own, who had gone away and come back as something the world had needed without knowing it needed it, and who had done the thing that armies could not in the dark on a frozen morning with a knife her brother had given her. The long night was over. The living world endured. And somewhere beyond the membrane of what is and what was never meant to be, the armies of Middle-earth returned to the Pelennor fields and finished their own war, carrying with them the memory of a different darkness and a different courage, and the knowledge that the fight for the living world was never limited to any single world alone. When you play the Game of Thrones, you win or you die.